Welcome to the Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're listening or watching from. We'd love to hear from our fellow mystery lovers around the world. Miss Marple and the Thorns of Rosewater Retreat. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The afternoon sun poured over the lawns of Rosewater Retreat, gilding every blade of grass and coaxing lazy bees to drift from bloom to bloom. On the wide front drive, a pair of doves bobbed between the polished wheels of a navy blue Daimler as it drew up, the sound of laughter and murmured greetings rising into the honeyed air. To those watching from the shade, especially to the keen, pale eyes of Miss Marple, there was something undeniably charged about the day, as if the heat had quickened not only the pulse of nature, but those of the guests arriving, each with secrets carefully tucked behind their best smiles. Miss Marple herself had arrived earlier, in the modest comfort of a local taxi, clutching her straw hat and carpet bag, both slightly faded but perfectly respectable. Lady Felicity Danvers, mistress of Rosewater, had greeted her with a warm kiss and a whispered, "I do so hope you'll enjoy the weekend, Jane. There's always a certain liveliness when people escape their routines, isn't there?" She had winked, a twinkle of mischief in her eyes. Now, as the afternoon ripened, Miss Marple sat beside an open window in her rose-scented suite, her knitting basket at her feet, observing the scene unfolding below. It was, she reflected, very much like watching the overture to a play, characters establishing their parts, subtle glances exchanged, gestures loaded with meaning. She noted Lady Amberleigh's arrival with interest. The heiress glided from her sports car with feline grace, her hair like liquid gold beneath the sun, her summer dress clinging in all the right places. She paused, head tilted, surveying the crowd as if deciding which hearts to trouble first. At her side was Julian Graves, the novelist, his arm lingering just a moment too long at Amberleigh's waist, his eyes sharp, darting, already cataloguing the drama for future pages. Nearby, Diana West, slender, tanned, brimming with energy, tossed her tennis bag onto a stone bench and called out for someone to join her on the courts. The way she watched Sir Marcus Blythe was anything but sporting. Sir Marcus, for his part, was absorbed in conversation with Lady Felicity, but his gaze often wandered, sometimes towards Diana, sometimes towards Amberleigh, sometimes elsewhere altogether. Lucia, the young maid, darted between guests, her nervous hands smoothing her apron, her cheeks flushed. More than once, Miss Marple saw Lucia pause, head bent towards the undergardener, a handsome, brooding figure with a scar at his lip, her whisper almost lost in the drowsy hum of the garden. Inside the main house, the staff readied the bar for cocktails, champagne chilling in silver buckets, crystal glasses catching the late sun. Doors stood open to the terrace, where white linen cloths fluttered, and the scent of gardenias hung in the air. Laughter drifted, low, throaty, the kind that suggested secrets and shared memories. Someone played a slow jazz record, the music curling into corners, settling like silk around shoulders bared by evening gowns. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her needles clacking softly. She had always believed that outside the pages of detective novels, the real theatre of life unfolded at such gatherings. People, freed from the eyes of neighbours and routines, revealed much more than they intended, a hasty touch, a sharp glance, an oddly chosen word. She had seen it in St. Mary Mead 1,000 times, and she saw it now at Rosewater, magnified by sun and champagne and the intoxicating promise of summer. After unpacking, she wandered the garden, pretending to admire the late roses, though in truth she catalogued the footpaths, the shadowy hedges, the secluded bench by the lake, places where lovers might meet, or secrets be whispered. She paused beneath a wild old trellis tangled with jasmine. The perfume was almost dizzying, and from here she could see the reflection of the house in the water, the blur of figures inside. As the evening settled, the guests dressed for cocktails. The men wore crisp linen, the women shimmered in silk and satin, skin glowing in the last rays of the sun. Miss Marple took her place on the terrace, quietly knitting, an unassuming presence among the glittering crowd. Around her, conversation shimmered with suggestion. Darling, not here. Someone might see—" "Did you see the look she gave him at lunch? I'd die if anyone found out." She listened, her face composed, her eyes missing nothing. When Lady Amberleigh, laughing, brushed past Sir Marcus and let her hand linger on his wrist just a second longer than necessary, Miss Marple raised a pale eyebrow and turned another row of stitches. The tension was as thick as the dusk, and somewhere just beyond the reach of music and laughter, something darker waited to step out into the open. The night deepened, lamps glowed on the terrace, moths battered at the glass. Miss Marple finished her tea and slipped away, unseen, her mind already whirring with possibilities. She paused before returning to her room, glancing back at the garden. From the shadows, two figures slipped out beneath the rose trellis, a soft laugh, a hurried hush, the beginning of a story, or perhaps the end of one. Either way, Miss Marple knew, in such an atmosphere, secrets would not stay buried for long. Chapter 2. Morning Whispers. The dawn at Rosewater Retreat arrived on a hush, the light seeping through gauzy curtains, casting silver and gold across satin sheets and sleeping faces. Somewhere in the distance, a thrush sang, its melody sweet but laced with melancholy, as if sensing that the peace of the estate was only surface deep. Miss Marple was awake long before the first bell sounded from the kitchens. She had always believed that the soul of a house could be heard in the silence before breakfast, the soft shuffle of feet, the quickening breath behind a closed door, the occasional creak of a floorboard from a corridor not meant to be travelled before sunrise. From her window she saw evidence of the night's secrets. A silk scarf, crimson and careless, hung from the iron railing of the balcony below. A calling card of romance, or perhaps a warning. A man's glove, too fine for a gardener, rested on the back of a garden bench, dew glistening on the leather. Far out by the lake, ripples spread from the jetty, as if someone had slipped away for a solitary swim, or something had been dropped beneath the water's surface. Breakfast in the morning room was a subdued affair. Gone was the easy laughter of the night before, replaced by a certain stiffness, furtive glances, stifled yawns, a collective air of having barely slept. Lady Amberleigh arrived late, her hair unbrushed, a lover's shadow in her eyes, her silk dressing gown pulled hastily over last night's dress. She gave a languid smile to Julian Graves, but the novelist's return smile was guarded, almost brittle. Diana West, glowing in tennis whites, seemed determined to act as if nothing had happened. She recounted tales of tournaments and famous partners, her laughter bright and brittle, but her gaze kept flickering to Sir Marcus Blythe, who barely touched his toast and looked pale in the morning light. Lucia the maid hovered by the sideboard, distracted, her hands trembling so much she nearly upset a pot of marmalade. Miss Marple, delicate and almost invisible in the corner, sipped her tea and watched. She noticed how Lady Amberleigh's hand trembled as she buttered her toast. She observed the faint trace of lipstick, much darker than Amberleigh's usual shade, smudged on Julian Graves' collar. She noted that Sir Marcus's shoes were still damp from the dew, as if he'd walked the garden paths before anyone else had risen. A sudden clatter made everyone start. Lucia, cheeks flaming, had dropped a spoon onto the marble floor. She apologized, eyes darting nervously to the window overlooking the rose garden. It was then that Lady Felicity Danvers, always brisk in a crisis, announced she would take her usual morning stroll through the gardens. "A little fresh air will set us all to rights, I'm sure," she declared, trying to dispel the heaviness. Several guests offered to join, but she waved them off. "Nonsense. Enjoy your breakfast. Jane, would you care to accompany me?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "With pleasure, Felicity. A little walk is always the best way to clear the mind." They set out through the French doors, the air fresh and cool, a faint mist still lingering over the lawns. Roses glistened with droplets, the world momentarily pure and untouched. Yet as they neared the old trellis, Miss Marple felt the atmosphere shift, something tense and sorrowful lingering in the air. Lady Felicity paused, brow furrowing. There, beneath the riot of climbing roses, a white silk slip was caught on a thorn, stained with something dark, a patch of red, stark and shocking against the pale fabric. Miss Marple moved closer, heart tightening. The slip was not empty. A pale arm, adorned with delicate gold bangles, stretched out from beneath the petals. The figure lay still, her golden hair tangled among the blooms. It was Lady Amberleigh. A sharp cry escaped Lady Felicity, cutting through the hush of the garden. The world seemed to stand still, the only sound the persistent song of the thrush, and distantly the hurried footsteps of the other guests running towards the commotion. Within moments, the garden was transformed. Guests clustered by the rose trellis, faces pale and eyes wide, their seductive masquerade from the night before now stripped bare by fear. Sir Marcus stumbled back, Diana gasped and clung to his arm, and Julian Graves stood frozen, a look of stunned disbelief on his handsome face. Lucia the maid turned and fled, sobbing, her apron fluttering behind her like a banner of surrender. Miss Marple remained silent, but her eyes missed nothing. The smudge of lipstick on Lady Amberleigh's cheek, the faint bruising at her wrist, the torn strap of her gown. The roses around her were trampled, and the patch of dew on the grass suggested more than one visitor to this hidden bower last night. The inspector would arrive soon. There would be questions, accusations, and attempts at alibi, but Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence and piercing mind, already sensed that the tangled web of desire and envy woven in the darkness would not easily be undone. And so the sultry mystery of Rosewater Retreat began, not with laughter and longing, but with a death both beautiful and terrible beneath the roses. Chapter 3. Perfume, lies, and the inspector's arrival. It did not take long for news of tragedy to spread across Rosewater Retreat. Within the hour, Inspector Hale arrived, a tall, dark-eyed man with an efficient stride and an air of having seen far too many human dramas. He found the garden still crowded, the scent of crushed roses mingling now with panic, and a faint note of something headier. Perfume, fear, regret. Lady Amberleigh's body had been respectfully covered with a linen cloth, but the tableau was still grim. The guests huddled nearby, their glamorous facades cracked by shock and something else. Relief, perhaps, for some. Fear for others. Miss Marple kept slightly apart, her pale blue cardigan neat, her knitting folded in her lap as she watched the inspector greet Lady Felicity with a solemn nod. "I'll need to speak to everyone, of course," Inspector Hale said gently. "But first, who found her?" Lady Felicity's voice shook only slightly. "Miss Marple and I, Inspector, we were walking before breakfast and—" She gestured helplessly at the rose trellis. Miss Marple gave her account, her manner mild but precise. "We saw a slip of silk on the thorns. At first, we thought it had simply caught in the wind, but then—" She paused, letting the implication settle. Her eyes never left the inspector's. He gave her a measured look, recognizing the keen intelligence behind the unassuming facade. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I understand you have something of a reputation for noticing the little things." She inclined her head, neither modest nor boastful. "It is often the little things, Inspector, that are most easily overlooked." He nodded. "Let's keep everyone close by, Lady Felicity." No one should leave the house or its grounds. The guests obeyed, though uneasily. In the lounge they gathered, draped over velvet sofas and fragile nerves, each of them nursing a drink and their own thoughts. Diana West sat apart, legs crossed, eyes fierce and red-rimmed. Sir Marcus hovered behind her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Julian Graves stood by the window, staring out at the lake, his reflection wavering in the glass. Lucia the maid had been summoned, but sat rigid, twisting a handkerchief until it nearly tore. The questioning began. Diana West was first, and her answers came quick and sharp. "I went to bed early, alone. I heard nothing until the screams." The inspector's eyebrows rose. "You're sure you didn't hear voices from the garden?" Diana's eyes flashed. "I'm a heavy sleeper, Inspector, and I don't eavesdrop." Sir Marcus Blythe was next. "I took a walk late last night. Couldn't sleep. The air was stifling." "Did you see anyone?" He hesitated, eyes darting briefly to Diana. "Number only, the moonlight on the water." Julian Graves kept his cool. "I went to the library after supper, writing notes, planning my next book. I lost track of time." The inspector's gaze lingered on the faint lipstick smudge, still shadowing Julian's collar. "Anyone with you?" Julian's lips twitched. "Writers are solitary creatures, Inspector." Lucia was last. I cleaned the terrace, then helped Mrs. Cole in the kitchens. I saw Lady Amberleigh. She was laughing with Mr. Graves. Later, I heard someone crying near the rose garden, but I didn't see who." Her voice trembled. Her eyes refused to meet Miss Marple's steady gaze. With each answer, the web seemed to tighten. Miss Marple, quietly present, let the conversation wash over her. But she noticed everything. Diana's expensive perfume lingering on the air longer than any alibi. Sir Marcus's hands, damp palms, nervous fidgeting, Julian's careful detachment, the way he glanced sideways at Lady Felicity, as if expecting some unspoken rescue. Lucia's raw fear, the barely concealed bruise on her wrist, the trace of garden mud on her shoe. Inspector Hale concluded his first round and excused himself to confer with Lady Felicity and the retreat's groundskeeper. In the lull, the guests shifted uneasily, tension running high as glances darted and silence pressed in. Miss Marple found herself joined by Diana, who forced a brittle smile. "Do you always come to these glamorous affairs, Miss Marple, or do you only arrive when murder's on the menu?" Miss Marple's answering smile was gentle. "One finds that glamour and danger are rather frequent bedfellows, my dear. And when people are away from home, they often let themselves slip, sometimes into temptation, sometimes into trouble." Diana's laugh caught in her throat. She turned away, but not before Miss Marple caught a glimmer of regret, or was it longing, in her eyes. Through the long windows, thunder rumbled on the horizon, the heat of the day promising a storm. In the garden, the rose trellis stood silent and foreboding, a monument to desire, secrecy, and violence. Miss Marple let her gaze wander over the group, her mind knitting together the night's seductions, the morning's lies, and the traces left behind. A silk slip, torn. A glove, wet with dew, perfume on the air, mingled with fear. A whisper, heard in the dark, too late to save a life. The first secrets had surfaced, but she knew the most dangerous ones were still hidden, entwined, like the roses themselves in beauty, pain, and longing. Tomorrow would bring confessions. Or perhaps another sin. Chapter 4. Roses, Rumors, and Midnight Footsteps. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke just after midnight. Rain lashed the leaded windows of Rosewater Retreat, thunder rumbled through the hills, and for a while the house was cloaked in restless shadows. Yet, when morning arrived, it did so with a hush. The gardens glittered, the air was cool and sharp, and the scent of rain-soaked roses drifted through every open window. Miss Marple, ever an early riser, left her suite with a purpose. She found Lucia in the scullery, hands red from scrubbing silver, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. The clatter of breakfast dishes carried from the kitchens, but Lucia barely seemed to notice. "Good morning, dear," Miss Marple said softly. "You were quite upset yesterday." Lucia glanced up, her lips trembling. "I'm sorry, madam. I didn't mean to run." "It was a dreadful shock for us all, but you said you heard someone crying in the garden last night." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, coaxing, never threatening. Lucia hesitated, wringing her apron. "Yes, madam. After midnight, I was putting out the rubbish by the kitchen door and I heard someone sobbing. Near the rose trellis, I thought it was Lady Amberleigh, but I didn't see her." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Sometimes it helps to speak plainly. You can trust me, Lucia." The maid's gaze flickered. "They all think it was just affairs, gossip. But I saw more. Sir Marcus was by the lake, smoking when he shouldn't have been outside. And Diana, she came in very late, from the orchard path. She had lost a pearl earring. I found it this morning, in the grass near the trellis." Miss Marple's mind ticked over these details, noting the earring and the paths. "Thank you, dear. I expect you've seen much working in a place like this." Lucia's eyes darted to the window. "There are always secrets here, madam. Some are harmless, some—" She broke off, swallowing hard. "Did Lady Amberleigh seem afraid of anyone?" Miss Marple asked, her tone almost conversational. "She laughed at everyone, but—" Lucia's voice dropped to a whisper. "She argued with Mr. Graves in the library. It was about a letter. She said she wouldn't be threatened. She called him a coward." Miss Marple pressed her hand again, then excused herself, leaving Lucia a little calmer but still haunted. She stepped out into the garden, the ground soft underfoot, petals bruised and glistening. The rose trellis was deserted, but the marks from yesterday's panic remained. Trampled grass, a broken stem, a faint reddish stain on a pale blossom. Miss Marple bent low, examining the earth. There, half buried in the mud, she found a cigarette stub with a gold tip, not the sort smoked by Sir Marcus, but by Lady Amberleigh herself. Yet next to it, something else. A muddy heel print, smaller than any man's, pointing away toward the orchard. She straightened, glancing around. The morning was so fresh it seemed to banish all thought of violence, but Miss Marple knew better. The house hummed with tension. From an upper window, Diana watched the garden, her gaze sharp and restless. At the far edge of the lawn, Sir Marcus wandered as if lost in thought. The inspector's car, parked discreetly by the stables, promised further interrogations. Miss Marple wandered to the lake's edge. The surface was still, but along the jetty she found another clue. A man's handkerchief, monogrammed J.G. She tucked it into her sleeve and returned to the terrace where Julian Graves was reading a letter, his lips drawn tight. She settled beside him, feigning mild curiosity. "A beautiful day, isn't it, Mr. Graves?" He nodded absently. "For some, perhaps. I never cared much for roses." Miss Marple watched his hands, one trembling slightly, the other crumpling the letter. "They can be dangerous, I suppose. Thorns, you know, or secrets hidden among the petals." His eyes darted to hers. "Secrets are best left buried, Miss Marple. The dead, too." She knitted quietly, her needles clicking like the ticking of a clock. I have always found that secrets have a way of blooming at the most inconvenient times. A sudden commotion broke the quiet. Diana West stormed onto the terrace, cheeks flushed, hair wild. She threw something on the table, a single pearl earring. "Find what you were looking for, Diana." Julian's voice was cold, mocking. Diana shot him a look of pure venom. "I don't need to answer to you or anyone." She turned on her heel and vanished back inside, leaving an air of drama that clung like perfume. Miss Marple tucked the earring into her pocket, already connecting threads in her mind. Someone had left the rose garden in a hurry last night. Someone else had circled the lake, their secrets now as exposed as the muddy paths. Passion, pride, jealousy, all blooming beneath the summer sun. A low rumble of thunder sounded, promising another storm. Inside, Inspector Hale summoned the guests for a second round of questions. The mask of glamour was slipping, the claws of suspicion tightening. And all the while, Miss Marple sat quietly, seeing what others missed, the longing, the envy, and the fear that lingered after midnight. Chapter 5. Velvet Clues and Shattered Alibis. Inspector Hale wasted little time. The storm clouds lingered over Rosewater Retreat, matching the mood within its walls, a hush of expectation, charged with the threat of something about to break. By mid-morning, the guests had been summoned once again to the lounge, where yesterday's glamour seemed almost an illusion, faces pinched, eyes wary, perfumes mingling with the tang of anxiety. Hale's questions were sharper now, his politeness edged with steel. He began with Julian Graves. "You were in the library after supper, you said. Did anyone see you?" Julian gave a smile so thin it was barely there. "Not unless the ghost of Mrs. Danvers was in need of a new plot, Inspector. I was quite alone." Hale's eyes flickered to Miss Marple, who only knitted, silent as snowfall. Diana West was next, brittle and on edge. "I came in late from the orchard. Yes, I lost an earring. No, I didn't see Lady Amberleigh. I went straight to my room." "But Lucia heard someone crying by the rose trellis," Hale pressed. Diana's fingers twisted in her lap. "It wasn't me. If it was, I wouldn't have stayed. I don't cry over spoiled heiresses." Sir Marcus Blythe followed, stiffer than before. "I walked by the lake. I was restless, couldn't sleep." "Did you see anyone?" He shook his head, but his gaze flickered. "Number? Just the reflection of the house in the water?" Hale noticed, but moved on. Lucia came last, her nerves barely holding. "I went out to the bins after midnight. I saw someone moving in the garden, but it was too dark. They wore white, I think. Or maybe it was just the moonlight." The questioning dragged on. As Hale worked, Miss Marple watched the subtle currents beneath the surface, small gestures, suppressed words, the glint of guilt or bitterness in an averted gaze. She saw how Diana's eyes lingered on Sir Marcus, and how Julian's knuckles whitened when he thought no one was watching. The dam finally broke when the groundskeeper entered, hat in hand. "Beg pardon, sir, but I found this by the boathouse, looked out of place." He held out a crushed velvet ribbon, stained dark, a deep, sensual red, unmistakably Lady Amberleigh's, still faintly perfumed. Next to it, a gold locket dangled, snapped open, the tiny portrait inside smudged with damp fingerprints. Inspector Hale turned the locket in his hand, glancing from face to face. "Does anyone recognize this?" The silence was suffocating. Finally, Sir Marcus stood, face pale. "It was a gift, from me, for Amberleigh's birthday." He swallowed, voice tight. "She wore it last night." The room seemed to shudder. Diana's breath caught. Julian's eyes narrowed, calculating. Lucia looked as if she might faint. Miss Marple said quietly, "If it was by the boathouse, perhaps Lady Amberleigh meant to meet someone there." Or was she lured? She looked at Marcus. "You said you walked by the lake, but not near the boathouse." Sir Marcus hesitated. "No, I didn't go that far." Inspector Hale's gaze hardened. "We'll need to check the boathouse and the lake immediately." The guests were left in uneasy silence as the inspector and staff hurried out. Miss Marple turned to Diana, whose eyes shimmered with defiance and something more fragile. "You cared for Sir Marcus, didn't you, dear?" she said gently. Diana's voice was almost a whisper. "He was never mine, not really. Amberleigh, she took everything she wanted. She always did. I suppose she thought Marcus was just another prize." Miss Marple nodded, her tone soft. "Desire can be a dangerous motive, but it doesn't always end in murder." Diana gave a strangled laugh. "Maybe not for you, Miss Marple." A commotion drew them to the window. By the lake, Inspector Hale's team was pulling something from the shallows, a man's shoe, mud-caked, far too elegant for any gardener. Julian Graves was standing behind them, face chalk-white, fists clenched. In the lounge, Sir Marcus sat heavily on a sofa, head in his hands, as Diana hovered near him, but dared not touch. Lucia had slipped away, perhaps to cry, or perhaps to hide. Miss Marple surveyed the room, a tangle of longing, shame, and dread. The clues were becoming clearer: a ribbon by the boathouse, a locket torn in anger or despair, a man's elegant shoe lost in a desperate flight, confessions half-spoken, glances charged with history. But the truth was never as simple as passion gone wrong. Miss Marple knew there was always something quieter, more cunning, beneath the obvious. As the storm broke again outside, she considered the pieces she had gathered. There was still one secret that hadn't yet surfaced, one that would shift everything. She smiled to herself, quietly dangerous in her certainty. The night's seductions were giving way to something colder now, the truth. Chapter 6. Midnight Confessions. Night at Rosewater Retreat had always held a special kind of magic, a thrill that made even the air feel dangerous. On that particular night, when secrets bloomed as recklessly as the garden's red roses, the retreat was humming with desire and jealousy. Later, no one could agree on what time the music finally stopped, or when the moon slipped behind the clouds and left the house in darkness. Everyone's memory was clouded, but one in particular returned to those hours with painful clarity. Diana West sat by her open window, bare feet curled beneath her as the storm crept in. She remembered the heavy perfume, the lingering heat, the murmurs of laughter and longing drifting up from the terrace. Below, in the shadow of the rose trellis, figures moved, draped in silk and moonlight, faces obscured, hands clasped or cast aside. She had seen Lady Amberleigh slip away from the crowd, a pale figure in a white slip, trailing red velvet behind her. Moments later, Marcus followed, tense, shoulders squared, holding something clenched in his fist. Diana's heart clenched with something she wouldn't name. Unable to resist, Diana threw a shawl around her shoulders and padded down the back stairs, careful not to disturb the sleeping house. The hallway was dark, but she could hear voices drifting from the garden, a woman's laughter, edged with cruelty, a man's voice wounded and pleading. Diana crept closer, hidden by the trellis. The moon shone for a moment, lighting the scene in silver. Amberleigh facing Marcus, locket glinting at her throat, lips curled in a taunt. "Is that all I was to you?" Marcus's voice was raw. "A game, a trophy." Amberleigh tossed her head, golden hair wild in the wind. "Oh, darling, you were never even a challenge." Diana felt a surge of anger, at Amberleigh, at Marcus, at herself. She clutched her shawl tight, unable to move or turn away. She saw Marcus reach for Amberleigh's wrist, saw her pull back, laughing. Then, suddenly, Amberleigh slapped him, hard, the sound echoing across the garden. A shadow moved at the edge of Diana's vision. Someone else, watching or waiting. The quarrel dissolved into chaos. Amberleigh spun away, stumbling toward the lake, her slip catching on the roses. Marcus called after her, voice thick with fury. Diana, torn between jealousy and fear, ducked behind the trellis just as another figure stepped into the moonlight. Julian Graves. He looked as if he'd been running, shirt untucked, eyes wild. He caught Amberleigh's arm by the water's edge. There was a struggle, voices raised in a language Diana didn't understand. Amberleigh shoved him away, the locket snapping from her neck, falling to the ground. Julian swore, bending to pick it up. From her hiding place, Diana saw it all, the passion, the pain, the tangled web of attraction and resentment. She wanted to intervene, but dread held her back. In the distance, thunder rolled, the storm breaking at last. Amberleigh wrenched free, running back towards the roses, Julian close behind. Diana saw them vanish into darkness, heard the sharp cry, a gasp, then silence. After that, everything blurred. The rain pounding, shadows fleeing, someone sobbing nearby. Lucia, perhaps, or Diana herself. She found herself back in her room before dawn, drenched and shaking, one pearl earring missing, her heart battered by what she'd witnessed and what she'd done, nothing. Now, recalling it all with the clarity of daylight, Diana felt sick with guilt. She had seen so much and yet understood so little. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass, whispering a prayer to the gathering clouds. In the garden below, Miss Marple wandered, pausing at every clue, her eyes missing nothing. Diana watched her, wondering if anyone could untangle the knots they'd all tied themselves into. Back inside, Inspector Hale continued to prowl the corridors, questions growing sharper, suspicions mounting. Julian brooded by the fire, Marcus stared out at the rain, and Lucia moved through the house like a ghost. As evening approached, Miss Marple gathered everyone in the lounge, her gentle voice rising above the storm's rumble. "I believe we are all ready to hear the truth," she said, eyes sweeping the room. But the truth was a dangerous thing at Rosewater Retreat. Seductive, damning, and about to be laid bare. Chapter 7. The Unmasking Hour. Evening descended on Rosewater Retreat with a hush, as though the house itself braced for revelation. The storm outside had passed, but its memory lingered. Wet leaves clung to the windows, the scent of rain and roses hung thick in the air. The guests were summoned once more to the lounge, their faces pale with fatigue and dread. Miss Marple sat at the centre of the room, her knitting untouched in her lap. Inspector Hale stood beside her, notebook closed. There was no need for further questions, only answers. Lady Felicity poured sherry for the guests, her hands trembling. Diana West sat stiffly on the sofa, gaze fixed on the fireplace. Sir Marcus paced behind her, pausing now and then to shoot anxious glances at Julian Graves, who lounged by the bookcase, arms crossed. Lucia stood near the door, fingers twisting her apron. Miss Marple's voice, gentle but commanding, drew every eye. "My friends, we have all been haunted by the events of last night, and by the passions and secrets that led us here. If you will allow me, I should like to describe what truly happened, step by step. Perhaps together we may bring peace to Lady Amberleigh and to ourselves." A tense silence fell. Inspector Hale nodded for her to continue. Miss Marple began, her words soft but clear. "First, let us remember the garden after midnight, a place of beauty, yes, but also of shadows and hidden paths. Lady Amberleigh left the party early, seeking the quiet of the roses, or perhaps a rendezvous. She was followed first by Sir Marcus, then by Julian, and, unknown to them, by Diana as well." Sir Marcus stiffened. Diana's hands trembled in her lap. Miss Marple continued, "There was a quarrel. Amberleigh, bold as ever, used her charms as weapons, wounding both Marcus and Julian in ways only the heart can bleed. She spurned Marcus, taunted him for his devotion. Marcus, shamed, tried to win her back, but she laughed and struck him. Julian arrived then, desperate to reclaim a locket, perhaps a token of blackmail, or simply a souvenir of love gone sour. They struggled by the lake. The locket snapped. Words turned to threats. Julian's knuckles whitened, his jaw clenched. In the confusion, Amberleigh ran again, slipping through the roses, where Diana waited, unseen, heart torn by jealousy and longing. Diana, I believe you followed Amberleigh, hoping for a final word, or perhaps to warn her away from Marcus. Instead, you witnessed her humiliation of both men, the tension, the rivalry, the desire, all swirling under moonlight. Diana's eyes filled with tears. She bit her lip, but said nothing. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. And then someone else was there, someone small and frightened, who had seen too much and understood too little. Lucia. She heard the weeping, the angry voices. In the darkness, she tried to comfort Amberleigh, but the heiress, drunk on triumph or despair, lashed out, pushing Lucia aside. The maid fled, unseen by the others. Lucia sobbed softly, pressing her hands to her face. Miss Marple's voice dropped, almost a whisper. The truth, I fear, is both simple and terrible. In the end, it was not the great passions of the heart that killed Lady Amberleigh, but a sudden, panicked act of self-defense. Diana, you found Amberleigh as she stumbled back toward the trellis, furious, disheveled. She mocked you for loving Marcus, for not being bold enough to fight for what you wanted. You reached for her, perhaps only to plead. She struck you hard, as she had struck the others. In the struggle, you pushed back just once. She slipped, caught her arm on the thorned roses and fell. The blood was from the thorns. The silence that followed was not murder, but fear. Diana's composure finally broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I didn't mean to. She said such cruel things. I lost myself. When she fell, I panicked. I ran. I told no one. I was ashamed. I thought perhaps one of them would be blamed instead. Sir Marcus moved to comfort her, his own eyes brimming. Miss Marple nodded, her own face sad but resolute. It is a tragedy, not a crime of malice. But all the same, it is the truth that frees us. Lady Amberleigh's power was in the pain she caused, but Diana, you must now face what you did, not alone, but with those who still care for you. Inspector Hale moved quietly, his hand resting gently on Diana's shoulder. Thank you, Miss Marple. The law will judge, but compassion has its place too. The room was quiet now, the storm's echo replaced by a hush of sorrow and relief. Lucia wept openly. Julian closed his eyes in resignation. Sir Marcus and Lady Felicity embraced Diana, holding her as she shook with regret. Miss Marple, rising slowly, collected her knitting and walked to the window. The rain had stopped, and beyond the garden, new roses were already opening to the evening sun. She knew, as she always had, that the most dangerous passions are those we keep secret, and the only way through darkness is with the light of truth. Chapter 8. Roses after rain. Days passed at Rosewater Retreat, and with each sunrise, the memory of that terrible night softened, though it never quite faded. The investigation concluded quietly. Inspector Hale, after speaking at length with Diana, recommended mercy. Lady Amberleigh's death was ruled a tragic accident, a fall sharpened by pride and jealousy. Diana, pale and subdued, remained as Lady Felicity's guest, consoled by Sir Marcus, and forgiven though not absolved by the house's gentle routine. The guests departed slowly, carrying their own secrets away with their luggage. Julian Graves left first, taking with him a battered manuscript that, it was rumoured, contained a love story more tragic than any he'd written before. Lucia stayed on at the retreat, her sorrow and fear eased at last by Miss Marple's quiet kindness and Lady Felicity's motherly care. Rosewater itself seemed to sigh with relief. The roses bloomed more fiercely than ever, their thorns hidden beneath lush petals. The staff returned to their duties. Laughter and music, soft, cautious, once again drifted from the terrace on warm evenings. Miss Marple, her visit nearly at an end, walked the gardens one last time with Lady Felicity. They paused at the trellis where fresh white roses now grew in place of those stained by blood. "It's remarkable," Felicity murmured, "how swiftly a place recovers when the truth is brought into the open." Miss Marple smiled. "Gardens heal. So do people, given sunlight, forgiveness, and a little patience." Felicity squeezed her friend's hand. "You always see the good, Jane, even in the darkest corners." Miss Marple shook her head, her eyes bright with wisdom. "Not always the good, my dear, but I do see people, truly, their weaknesses, their longing, their strengths. In every heart, a little foolishness and a little hope." They strolled in silence, the air heavy with the scent of rain-washed petals. Inside, Diana was writing a letter, her hand steady for the first time in days. Sir Marcus waited with quiet devotion, promising nothing but understanding. Lucia, tending the roses, hummed a tune of her childhood. That evening, as Miss Marple packed her bag and folded her shawl, Lady Felicity came to her door. "You must promise to return next summer, Jane. I can't guarantee it will be less dramatic, but I promise there'll be fewer secrets." Miss Marple's laughter was soft, but genuine. "My dear Felicity, wherever there are roses and moonlight, there will always be secrets. But I shall look forward to them all the same." The taxi pulled away from Rosewater Retreat beneath a sky of pale blue and gold. Miss Marple glanced back at the house, its windows bright, its walls strong once more. She thought of love in all its forms, reckless, tender, destructive, and healing. She thought of the roses, how, even after the hardest rain, they dared to open again. And she smiled, for she knew that in every ending there was the promise of another story, and in every secret the seed of understanding.